Marcion of Sinope was a late 2nd century Gnostic Christian who believed that the God of the Hebrew Bible was the demiurge of the earth. And of course, the earth is a place of suffering and death. And that the God of Jesus was a different deity, more transcendent and more morally responsible. He has to be understood as one of the really true intellectuals of the 2nd century. Either he was responsible for or preferred a version of the Gospel of Luke that was very slender on allusions to the Hebrew Bible and to omit references to the prophets, to Moses, to Jesus' birth being the result of prophecies. So there's no infancy narrative at all in the Gospel of Luke, according to Marcion.
Dr. Dennis MacDonald, Marcion. I have heard that he made some ruckus in the 2nd century in the Christian era, if I could call it that, in the Roman world. He made some ruckus. He had some ideas. He had a gospel and 10 epistles, and wow, people wrote a lot about him. Though we don't have his writings, we have writings that pretty much have his writings. So can you tell us about Marcion's gospel? What was he teaching? And I know it might get a little into the complexity of the debate, but people who are watching, they didn't click this because they don't know something or aren't curious about Marcion. There are people who even today think Marcion's gospel was earliest, or like different ideas that, may not be in the scholarly realm, but there's a lot of conspiracy built up around this guy. So can you tell us the latest, greatest on the scholarship and what your take is on this?
Thank you, Derek. It's always a pleasure to talk about these esoteric topics and to make the discussion among scholars more public. And you're so good at that with MythVision. I hope people who are watching contribute to your good efforts. I certainly have, and I appreciate it very much. Marcion of Sinope was a late 2nd century Gnostic Christian who believed that the God of the Hebrew Bible was the demiurge of the earth. And of course, the earth is a place of suffering and death. And that the God of Jesus was a different deity, more transcendent and more morally responsible. So that's really a simplified understanding of who Marcion was. He was an intellectual. He has to be understood as one of the really true intellectuals of the 2nd century. He made his money on shipbuilding and had followers and set himself up in Rome at some point. But the scholarly discussion now about Marcion largely relates to fragments of Marcion's gospel, which he called the Evangelion. It did not have the name of an apostle or a disciple related to it, as the canonical gospels do. It did not include the Acts of the Apostles. The favorite text that he chose was the Gospel of Luke, but either he was responsible for or preferred a version of the Gospel of Luke that was very slender on allusions to the Hebrew Bible. And for obvious reasons, Marcion liked it and may have concocted, I think he more likely was the one who abbreviated the Gospel of Luke to omit references to the prophets, to Moses, to Jesus's birth being the result of prophecies. So there's no infancy narrative at all in the Gospel of Luke, according to Marcion, his Evangelion. You also have an Apostolicon, that is a collection of Paul's letters that is missing the pastoral epistles and is somewhat different from what you would find in most collections of Paul's epistles. But we're going to talk about the Evangelion. It does not exist. Not a fragment of it survives, as far as we know. Although there are a few papyri where they actually it's perhaps even likely that it is a fragment, but it certainly isn't a complete work. So it's similar to the Q document in that it has to be reconstructed by later citations or allusions to it. But in the case of Marcion's Gospel, we're somewhat more, we're luckier because we have references to Marcion in Irenaeus, in Tertullian, in Epiphanius, and the Adamantius dialogues, all written by opponents of Marcion or Marcionites. But in many cases, we find either citations or notifications of things that are missing, or we have alternative wording or things simply not attested, but we don't know it could have been there, it may not have been there. And this has been, there was an attempt to reconstruct Marcion's Gospel by Adolf Harnack. And recently, Dieter Roth did a magisterial reconstruction of the fragments using criteria for determining what in Tertullian or Epiphanius or so on one could use to create this gospel. So it's somewhat like the reception of the Q document, where you try to reconstruct it by assessing the double tradition in Matthew and Luke, although my way of reconstructing it is quite different from that. So I'm just giving an analogy. So Roth's reconstruction has a Gospel of Luke that is much shorter. It is much less interested in the Hebrew scriptures, although there still are residual allusions to and positive allusions to the biblical tradition, the Jewish biblical tradition. So there are a number of questions that revolve right now among Marcion's Gospel. One is, how does one reconstruct it? So Dieter Roth is usually is very close to Harnack's reconstruction of it, but there's another reconstruction of it that's related to Matthias Klinghardt and Marcus Vincent and now David Probisch. And they think that Marcion's Gospel was not only the earliest Gospel of Luke, but it was the earliest Gospel of all. And it thus replaces, in study of the synoptic problem, Q. So that you don't have a Q, they would say it never existed, that Marcion's Gospel is earlier. Also, Klinghardt has a different way than Dieter Roth in reconstructing the Gospel of Marcion. And that's because he considers certain agreements with the Western text of Matthew, for example, as a way of saying that you can use textual criticism as well as citations of Marcion in the Heresiologists for the reconstruction. Now, this, of course, is very esoteric stuff. We're deep in the weeds, and many of your viewers may be turned off already for that. But I won't go into the reconstruction. I want to talk about where people variously lodge the Gospel of Marcion in the growth of the Gospels. So I've talked about Klinghardt and Probisch and Vincent, who argue that it's the earliest Gospel of all. Others say, no, it is a primitive version of the Gospel. And by the way, they would then say that the canonical Luke is an argument against Marcion by loading the canonical Luke up with biblical allusions. So you have these prophecies at the beginning of about the birth of Jesus. You have other places where the biblical allusions are added. Dieter Roth is more cautious about that, and I think he's right in assuming that this is a truncation of canonical Luke. Canonical Luke is earlier, and this is a later truncation. Now, did Marcion do it himself, or did he receive it? So then you would have Marcion's gospel at the end of the synoptic tradition and not at its beginning. Another scholar who is one of my students and is a friend of mine, Jason Badoon, argues not that the Marcion gospel is the earliest gospel, but that Marcion's creation of a New Testament that had a gospel and a collection of epistles is the beginning of the New Testament. It's the earliest time that you have a collection of early Christian documents that serve a canonical purpose, and that later on you had other versions of the New Testament. I find that problematic for other reasons as well. But I want to say how my work in mimesis contributes to the discussion. If I'm right that Luke is so heavily dependent on Mark's imitations of Homer, and that Luke himself imitates Greek poetry, including Homer, and add the Acts of the Apostles as another place where Luke imitates classical Greek poetry, it becomes very difficult to sustain the notion that Marcion's gospel is earlier than the canonical gospel, because many of the parallels between Luke and the Greek poems appear only in canonical Luke. And when you have a truncation of canonical Luke, you lose those parallels, which would mean that you have to have imitations of classical Greek poetry both in canonical Luke and in Marcion's gospel. And I just find that to be much more difficult to absorb. So I don't know what questions you want to ask me about it, but let me summarize where we are. We don't have extant large manuscripts of Marcion's gospel, but we know it existed. We have various ways of reconstructing it, but in any reconstruction, we don't have the infancy narratives. We have a truncation of many of the stories and an omission, and a strategic omission of biblical allusions to the Hebrew Bible. So is it an earlier version of the Gospel of Luke, and then canonical Luke is an expansion to oppose Marcion? Or is it a later truncation of the canonical gospel? And this is what Tertullian is arguing, that canonical Luke and Acts are earlier, and that Marcion has truncated it and removed it. The other is Marcion's Evangelion and Apostolicon, the earliest New Testament, is even so. If the Marcion's gospel is before canonical gospel, does it replace Q? So I know that's confusing, and in fact, the getting in the weeds and the reconstruction of the Greek, we just can't do on a podcast. But that's why there's so much positive energy about this question, and it still is very much open-ended.
So just a couple things. There's some serious beef between Irenaeus and Marcion. I've heard scholars on one end say Irenaeus is not a fan of him and has an axe to grind. I've heard serious scholars say Marcion is not a fan of Irenaeus and he would have an axe to grind, or at least they're just not fans of each other's work. Sure. Some scholars I've talked to say they think that Marcion had something, whatever, a primitive whatever, and that someone came in and like updated the Luke gospel, giving it the canonical version. I like what you brought up here. But here's my thing, and I'm sure I am ignorant on the details, so I'm throwing it at you, especially I think you had a recent conversation with Vincent, Dr. Vincent. So here's my thing. let's just hypothetical for the sake of argument. Let's just say, okay, Marcion had an earlier gospel that actually was earlier. What evidence would that prove to say that this replaced Q and that it's the earliest? Isn't that complete speculation to then assume it? Can't there be competing models of gospels that are out and this is just another one and it doesn't have to replace Q? Or I just don't get the jump to saying, oh, well, by the way, because this was an earlier version of Luke, we already in our synoptic problem solution, we see Luke as very late in the day. We already see Mark and Matthew before Luke. So why does this have to be the first? Is there some thinking involved that I'm missing or something? I don't know.
That's a very good question. And I don't have a very clear answer on it myself, because I think that connection of saying that you have an early Marcion gospel and you don't, and it replaces Q, it doesn't make sense to me. But I can tell you how they would make it make sense. We know that the Gospels, when you have a 4-gospel collection, or at least more than one gospel with each other, that the scribes are harmonizing the Gospels so that the differences among them get worked out and softened, so that the great disparities in the texts of these Gospels earlier on gets papered over. And almost all of the actual manuscripts that we have of the Gospels occur after the mid of the 2nd century, when these Gospels then are traveling together, including the Gospel of John. So that allows people to be skeptical that you can reconstruct the Q document, because Matthew and Luke already are intercorrupted. And so that you have Matthean readings in Luke, Lutheran readings in Matthew, and you really can't be sure that there is a Q. But you can argue, as they do, that the Marcion gospel, if it's earlier than Luke, is earlier than this homogenizing of the gospels in the 2nd century. So they're not saying that it's earlier, let's say, than 70. That would be very difficult, but that it is earlier than the harmonization of the 4-gospel collection somewhere in the 2nd century. So unfortunately, it seems to me that they're ignoring a lot of evidence. They're ignoring Papias, for example. They're ignoring other allusions to Matthew that you find in the Apocalypse of John and the uses of it in John. So I think this widespread skepticism about how to understand the relationship of Matthew, Luke, and Mark, because you have later harmonization, it is just way too skeptical. And it doesn't account for the hard work that Q scholars have done to show reverse priority in Luke over Matthew, for example, or Matthew's more primitive understanding of texts in the doublets. So it kind of throws a bomb into the synoptic problem, argues that you can't trust the Gospels prior to about 150, where you have this mid-2nd century harmonization of the Gospels, so that there's so much inter-gospel corruption that you really can't be so scientific about Q. That the Marcionite Gospel is earlier. If it's earlier than Luke, it could be earlier than that homogenizing.
Okay, so one last thing I think comes to mind. Suppose we stumbled across this text. We found his gospel, right? We're playing hypothetical. We find his gospel and we're seeing it, and it's primitive or whatever. I suspect, just as someone who works in the field, you're serious about methodology and how we would go about this. Do you think if we found the whole complete text of Marcion, like an early original or even a copy of a Marcion text, and we actually like, dude, this was a Marcionite scribe who legitimately copied Marcion. We could tell he made a spelling mistake here, whatever, whoop-de-doo. We see human hand in it, but this is really close to Marcion. Do you think we would be able to easily, with the tools we have now, see quickly which way actually makes the most sense if we had his text? So we find his gospel. Do you think reading that we would easily be able to find out quickly, hold on, he redacted some of this stuff? We could find like within the language or find a way that the Marcion had to have changed this, or that someone changed Marcion. Do you see what I'm trying to get at? Like, I hear that the debate is, a lot of people think Irenaeus says he's fudging the gospel. The gospel of Luke was earlier. Marcion's fudging it to get rid of the Jewish stuff, the Hebrew Bible, let's just say. But the other argument around is saying, no, you guys are adding to the gospel. You guys are the ones adding it. So if we took Marcion's perception and we accepted his word, Irenaeus is full of it. The heresiologists have an axe to grind against him. So you have two teams, you have two tribes, and literally the tribe is Marcion's right, you guys are wrong, or we go with the church fathers and Marcion's wrong, and they're heretics, and they're changing things because they have an agenda or whatever. So whoever side you're on is how you're going to win in your mind. I'm saying let's pretend neither side's right. We don't know anything, but we discover the text. We find the literature. Do you think we would be able to discover real quick and go, based on this literature, it looks like Marcion actually did fudge it and Irenaeus is right? Or, whoa, this is unique and primitive, and this absolutely seems like it could have been a primitive earlier gospel. Irenaeus and the church. You see what I'm trying to do?
Yeah, of course.
I'm having fun.
This is counterfactual, right? So it's conjecture. But it's fun, and it's okay to do. I would love to have a full text of Marcion's gospel. I, in fact, would salivate over it. I'd give up bacon in order to be able to see that text.
Right.
And yes, we would be able to make a better judgment about that text and the canonical tradition of Luke. Yes, we would be able to make that judgment. The bigger question for me, Derek, is what criteria would you use to make that judgment? And in this case, I would say Irenaeus is righter than those who would claim the priority of Marcion. And it has to do with mimesis criticism. Because if we had the text of Marcion, and I wish we did, we would see that the canonical, as far as we know, the canonical Luke, well, let me back off. If we had that to compare, we're just comparing these two, then it could go either way. Mm-hmm. But we don't have just those two. We also have the imitations that Luke has of classical Greek poetry and Homer. Now, which of these two is most faithful to the other text that Luke is using, or the text that he's using? And I've done my own work on this. It's actually in the synopsis, tucked away in an appendix, but it's a long appendix where I give the evidence, partially in Greek, partly in English. And I think it's going to be clear that canonical Acts is earlier and Marcion is a truncation.
If I may, this is good. So now we're getting somewhere really juicy. I did the hypothetical game to get people to follow and to hear you respond exactly the way you did earlier using the mimesis thing. I'm convinced Mark is definitely doing this. I'm convinced that Luke is absolutely doing this. I'm convinced that Matthew's doing something different. Not saying he doesn't get carryovers, but he doesn't seem to have the same agenda in the same way. He's more Hebrew Bible. Don't get me wrong. He's still Hellenized. But so we're on the same page. And if we use your mimesis, we're going to go. So if we found Marcion and we see like chopped off mimetic connections and things, we're like, dude, you tried to redact and you couldn't get Homer out of your gospel, is what you thought you were getting rid of Hebrew, but you screwed up getting rid of Homer and didn't realize what was happening. I like this. So this is why I'm like, I don't get the gist of trying to make Marcion's the first, okay? Because let's just say we found the gospel of Marcion, and unless you have an agenda, I just can't imagine there's not some type of agenda here. And here's why. Say we found Marcion's gospel and we go, what the heck? This is different looking. Well, using your mimesis, you're forcing them to have to say it's earlier than Mark. Because now at this point, they're going to go, well, your mimesis. Exactly right. That's why I'm saying you're saying it has to replace Q. Because if it doesn't replace Q, you're screwed. Marcion's caught red-handed with his pants down. So I'm with you in this and thinking, okay, what's going on? The other possibility is that's not even a possibility, bringing up Matthew on this. But anyway, let's not go off into the rabbit trails there. But I think this is an interesting thought exercise because and it makes you go, okay, are they now saying that they like Mark, Matthew, and Luke are all like being created and compiled in the mid-2nd century to try and create this conspiracy that Marcion is earlier? Like, how far do you want to go to make Marcion right on this matter? I don't know. I mean, I'm no expert. So you're just getting my energy and excitement here. So don't take me and crucify me. But I am curious to know, like, are you now going to date Mark in the 120s, 130s? How far?
I'm glad you brought the Markan parallels in, because you have places in both Marcion's gospel and in the canonical gospel where you have Markan influence, and Mark is imitating Homer, and so you have that radiation. I do want to say something positive though about these friends of mine.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a former student in the mix. I have friends. I have meals with them. I share a beer with a guy occasionally on this. So I know this crowd, and they are terrific scholars, and they are very good philologians. And what we can say is they are correct that around the time of Marcion and before, you have intergospel collection and contamination. So that it does mean that we have to be very careful with the textual criticism of all the gospels when we try to understand, say, the Western text or the minority texts or the various versions, because we already have versions of the New Testament, presumably, in Old Latin and perhaps Syriac, even by that time, potentially. So we do have to be very careful about the textual criticism, and these people are really working that over. So we do need to rethink the issue of canonical processes and the technical aspects of textual criticism. So they are opening that door, and I think it's got to be opened. But it ought to make us. It doesn't mean that they're right about Marcion's gospel. That it does mean that they're right in scolding us for being a little too quick to make judgments, even about Q, on the basis of the materials we have, because we do have 2nd century conflations of readings.